I was 7 years old when it first started, just in the neighborhood, hanging out, and then suddenly a cop car pulls up. Ugh, here we go again. Hey, what are you up to? What's your name? What's your address? For much of my youth and teenage years, this was a disempowering experience. It made me feel afraid, sad, and angry. Thankfully, though, by the time I had reached high school, I discovered politically conscious rap music that helped me process these feelings. I was particularly inspired by the politically infused verses of Tupac Shakur. Man, I'll never forget the first time I heard Tupac rap. Instead of a war on poverty, they got a war on drugs so the police can bother me. Whew. Lyrics like these resonated deeply with me as a black youth already receiving unwarranted police attention. They made me feel empowered, like I mattered, and later shaped my desire to become a racial justice lawyer. Grounded by this music, a lot of good guidance, and some luck, I eventually learned to deal with my early and uncomfortable run-ins with cops. But not all of my friends were equally successful. And neither was my younger brother. For him, it didn't stop at questioning. It evolved into arrests, and then stints within the criminal justice system. My brother's story is his and not mine to tell. I only share this with you to identify the forces that have brought me here. I've gone from being a black youth who was over-policed to lawyering for black lives, and now to public service that centers black lives. My personal and professional journey have made me deeply concerned about Canada's criminalization of black communities. Now, you might ask, what does this criminalization look like? Despite black people being 3% of Canada's overall population, 9% of Canada's federal prison population is black. This overrepresentation is very much connected to the ways in which black communities regularly have a high police presence, even when a crime has not occurred. This leads to a significantly high number of innocent black people in our city being treated as criminals. Now, often we excuse this as part of the natural costs of addressing gun and gang violence in our city. But it's actually making our city more unsafe. In this talk, I want to share with you a framework for social reform that can serve as an alternative to black criminalization. This framework uses a culturally responsive approach to addressing the issues of gun and gang violence that are plaguing our city. And this framework, it's inspired by the existing African principle known as Sankofa. My hope in sharing Sankofa with you is that it will help you see what I see when looking at gun and gang violence in our city. I want you to see it within the broader context of social disadvantage. And I want you to see this so that our city stops criminalizing black people under the guise of public safety. I want you to see this so that we can all have a better understanding as to why increased spending on policing has not and cannot solve the crisis of violence in our city. Toronto's police chief, Mark Saunders, has said, We can't arrest our way out of gun and gang violence. But if you look at our city's budget, it looks like that's exactly what we've been trying to do. With a police budget of more than $1 billion, our city now spends more on policing than it does on affordable housing, education, homelessness, childcare, parks and recreation services, arts and culture, combined. What this means is that a significant portion of your tax dollars are being dumped into ineffective police practices that target, monitor, and surveil Black communities. The latest example of this is the police practice of carding. In 2014, the Toronto Star reported that despite Black people being only 8% of our city's population, 27% of the folks carded by police were Black. The Toronto Star has also reported that between the years 2008 and 2011, the number of Black young men carded was so high that it was possible that every single young Black man in this city had been carded by police. You see, the problem with approaches like this is that they don't help lower crime. This kind of policing actually makes it harder to solve crime. Why? Because it breaches community trust. And the police need trust of the community to get access to crucial information to prevent and solve crime. A 2019 Supreme Court of Canada decision describes the social cost of carding this way. Carding takes a toll on an individual's physical and mental health. It impacts one's ability to pursue employment and education opportunities. Such a practice contributes to the continuing social exclusion of racial minorities. It encourages a loss of trust in the fairness of our criminal justice system, and it perpetuates criminalization. That's our Supreme Court of Canada. After much pressure from Black communities and their allies, the Ontario government finally abolished police carding in 2017. But by then, the damage had already been done, and lots of it irreparable. In December 2018, the Ontario Human Rights Commission reported that between the years 2013 and 2017, Black Torontonians were 20 times more likely than non-Black people in the city to die in an encounter with police. This same report showed that in those same years, Black people made up 70% of the victims of fatal police shootings in our city. 70%. In many of these instances, the police had no legal basis to stop and detain the Black individual that they ended up killing. And in more than 60% of those cases, the Black victim was unarmed. So what does this say to you about our city, Toronto, the good? As I mentioned to you, I believe that we can be much more effective at addressing gun and gang violence in our city. And I believe we can do so by invoking an Afrocentric principle known as Sankofa. See, Sankofa derives from the Akan people in Ghana, in West Africa. In English, Sankofa translates to reach back and get it. As a framework for social reform, Sankofa stands for the idea that we can only create a racially just future by correcting the racial injustices of the past. As a framework for social reform, Sankofa is a two-pronged approach. The first part requires that we identify and dismantle government laws, policies, and practices that perpetuate anti-Black racism. Carding is a prime example of this. Sankofa requires that we take the lessons learned from failed approaches of the past and we use them to re-envision and then reconstruct not just policing and the justice system, but also our systems of education, child welfare, healthcare, and other systems of social well-being. Now, this brings us to the second part of the Sankofa framework. As an African-inspired framework for social reform, Sankofa requires that we prioritize culturally relevant solutions that are developed by Black communities for Black communities. In other words, Sankofa stands as an expression of the principle, nothing about us without us. Now, I shared this framework with you, and I imagine some of you are now wondering, what does this Sankofa framework look like in actual practice? Well, I want to share with you one example. You should be interested to know that the city of Toronto boasts the world's only government office mandated to address anti-Black racism in government and society. I'm referring to the city of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. Launched in May 2018, this unit is responsible for supporting the city in fostering the implementation of the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism. This is an action plan that was developed by Black communities for Black communities in this city. Now, the work of this office and the action plan is to make diversity our strength more than a city motto, and not just for Black people, but for all of us. In August 2018, I left a successful legal career to join the City of Toronto unit. In the months leading up to this career move, I'd been visiting my brother in prison more than I ever had before. And we got closer. He started to open up, share things he hadn't before. He shared his struggles. He helped paint a picture that helped me see that because of systemic barriers in employment, education, mental health services, and housing in our city, many Black people in the city feel locked up without even needing to encounter a cop. Before these conversations with my brother, I had only ever imagined myself as a racial justice lawyer. But our conversations led me to expand my imagination, and I started to think about other ways that I can better Black lives in this city. It's also around this time that my thoughts about the future of the city gained an increased sense of urgency. I'd become a new father. For the first time, and unexpectedly, I found myself thinking about the kind of city that I wanted my daughter to grow up in. I started to think about legacy. Mine, but also this city's, for her, and for all who live in and love this city. And so with all of this in heart and mind, I decided to leave lawyering and join the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. And let me tell you, now, cities in the US, UK, and across Canada regularly reach out to us to learn about how the City of Toronto is leveraging Black talent, ideas, and perspectives to improve Black life in this city. There is growing global recognition that Toronto's approach is the future of truly cosmopolitan city building. Now, as exciting as this work is promising, its potential can only be realized if our city closes the dramatic funding gap that continues to exist between our resourcing of policing and our resourcing of social services. And that's where you come in. We need to push our city to rebalance its budget so that there's more equitable access to social services. Now, let me say this. I do honestly believe that there is a role for police to play in addressing the gun and gang violence that's tearing the social fabric of our city. But let me be honest. I don't think we need police more than we need social workers, employment counselors, addiction and mental health professionals, artists, libraries, tutors, public interest lawyers. And let me tell you, our city does have the resources to dramatically increase access to these services. The problem is, our public funds are way too tied up in the wrong places. But you can help fix this fiscal imbalance. And you can do it by asking yourself and asking anybody interested in these questions, this one question, over and over and over again. Is our city spending more on a community's problems than it is investing in its people? The Sankofa framework that I'm sharing with you supports making our city safer through more social reform that is used as a primary approach to public safety in our city. And I tell you, this wouldn't just make Black communities safer. This would make our entire city safer. And I truly believe that we have the courage and power to push our city to rebalance its spending priorities. And in doing so, we can create new possibilities for our entire city. But even as we find ways to work together to realize those possibilities, Sankofa must guide our approach. Now, what do I mean by this? The way forward must recognize and respect the agency of Black communities to lead our city with culturally responsive approaches to gun and gang violence that are troubling our entire city. Why? Because anything about us done without us does nothing for us. Now, I used to believe that if we just had fairer, more accountable policing and justice systems, things would be so much better in our city for Black people, including for individuals like my brother. But after years of work, reflection, and good therapy, I came to realize that that feeling was largely just guided by guilt. Guilt I feel for not being able to protect my little brother from police and prisons. For years, I tried to use that guilt to fuel my fight against injustice. But the harder I worked at justice reform, and the more he shared with me about the serious social gaps that exist in this city, the more I came to realize that changing policing and the whole criminal justice system simply isn't enough. These reforms alone cannot keep our city safe. We need a holistic approach to public safety in our city. Whether your field is finance, manufacturing, tech, marketing, social services, arts and culture, we all have a stake in increasing public safety in our city through advancing social reforms. And when I say social reforms, I am not just talking about the government. This must include the private sector as well. This is because real reform is integrative. It requires the skills and expertise of individuals from a range of professions, sectors, and industries. Individuals like you. And this is why I'm standing here to share with you the framework of Sankofa. My hope is that through this framework for social reform, you will more easily see that gun and gang violence in our city is a product of social inequality and systemic racism. And my hope is that in having you see this, you will act as allies, championing Sankofa as an approach to social change, to social transformation for our city. Now, I'm not the first to suggest that our city address gun and gang violence through social reforms that address the root causes of crime. There's nothing new about that. What's been missing, though, is a framework for social reform that offers a culturally responsive approach to gun and gang violence. And that's what Sankofa offers. Now, just as I was in high school, I remain inspired by the words of Tupac Shakur. And so, as I share with you why our city needs Sankofa, I think it's fitting for me to close with a remixed version of a message that Tupac leaves on one of his most famous songs, Changes. It's time for us as a city to start making some changes. Let's change the way we live. Let's change the way we police. Let's change the way we treat violence in our city. You see, the old way wasn't working, so it's on us to do what we gotta do so our whole city can thrive. Thank you.